Hi. Well, congratulations on finishing Chapter 1. That now takes us to Chapter 2. How do monsters reflect their time? Write an essay in which you respond to one of the following questions. And as you can see, we have a list of about a dozen or so questions here, taken from the variety of essays, poems, stories that we have in our Chapter 2. So I'm going to leave it to you to read those and then read the questions, reflection and response, or making connection questions. I do want to remind everyone, just in case there's any confusion still, these are the choices for the essay. Please do not pick different questions. Do not, for example, choose a question from the discussion thread that you are also currently working on. There's reasons I choose these questions. These are the ones that will make for the best essays. Okay? Now, the final draft of this essay will be due on Monday, May the 3rd, which seems like a long ways away, but it's really not. Our time passes very, very quickly here in our 8-week course. Be sure to follow the out-of-class essay guidelines for matters of form and style. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that means you have to go back to the introductory module and look at that out-of-class essay guidelines handout. And there's also a video that accompanies the handout. Please make sure you're following that along. I know for some of you, you may think these are just simply, mild suggestions. These are not mild suggestions. Right? This is what I expect you to do. Now, make sure you have a word count at the end of your essay. As we said in Chapter 1, it's very easy to recover a word count thanks to the modern computer. Remember, you must meet minimum requirements, including word count, sources, and subject matter. No late essays will be accepted. I do accept essays that have, shall we say, if you have a verified medical or legal excuse. But please remember, computer breakdowns are not acceptable. Breakups with boyfriends and girlfriends are not acceptable excuses. Having to leave town because your pet dog needs to go to the vet in Sacramento is not an acceptable excuse. Well, that's the beauty of the online world, though, right? You can go up to Sacramento with your pooch and still get the work done. So there. Submit a thesis statement and topic outline, just as we've done with the first essay, to Canvas on Friday, April 23rd, which, by the way, in case you're wondering, also happens to be Shakespeare's birthday. Just throwing that out there. Have MLA citations for 2 sources, none from the textbook. Okay, 2 sources. These are 2 sources derived from research. Do not cite the textbook, okay? In other words, I am forcing us to now get out of the textbook and out into the world. And this might include our library. Right? If you're not familiar with how to use the Mesa College Library, please refer to the Triangle of Research videos. It's a 3-part series. Part 1 basically covers how to find books in the library, and I should be very clear, it has been updated for COVID to just simply deal with ebooks, because those are the kind of books that you can still get even though you can't go to our library on campus and walk in the door and pull out a book off the shelf. We still have many, many, many ebooks. So part 1 covers ebooks. Part 2 covers magazines and journals and newspapers. So the articles that you can get primarily from our Mesa College databases. And part 3 isn't really about the library. Part 3 is about the internet. So part 1, part 2, part 3. If you haven't availed yourself of them for Chapter 1, now is the time. A participation grade will be assigned for the topic outline, okay? Then the class will be divided into peer groups, just as we did in Chapter 1. These will be new groups, but please use the same instructions that you did for Chapter 1 on how to get to your group Canvas page. Submit your rough draft to your Canvas work group and to me by Wednesday, April the 28th, okay? Some of you, because this is new, of course, and some of my students aren't the most detail-oriented people I've ever met in my life, either sent it just to the work group or just sent it to me. If you do that, you will not get credit. You need to send it to both and do it in a timely fashion so that your work group is actually able to work on your rough draft. They are actually able to do the peer edits. Now, please also submit peer editing sheets to your Canvas group and to me by Friday, April the 30th. Okay, so you have basically 2 days to read each other's rough drafts, fill out a peer edit sheet, resubmit it. And then, of course, between that Friday and Monday, you're using those peer edit guidelines, you're using the input that you got from your peers, as well as your own thoughts to construct your final draft. Okay. Now, the minimum requirements on Chapter 2, basically the same length, 1,000 words to roughly 1,400 at the top end. Please follow the strong essay structure, including introduction, concession. Right? Remember, concession are the counter arguments or arguments against your point. Rebuttal arguments, main body, and conclusion. If this is new to you or you're still not able to understand, again, go back to the introductory module where there is a standard argumentative essay handout and accompanying video. Now, you need citations from at least 2 different sources that originate in print or have print analogs. Keep in mind that print analog or originate in print means it's a book, a magazine, a newspaper, a journal, a government report or document of some kind. Something that appeared in print or at least has a print analog, meaning it's in print as well as web. What it is not is a movie. It's not a website that has no print analog. Okay, those are acceptable. You can use them in your essay, but they don't count for meeting this requirement. Now, at least one of your sources must be scholarly. And by the scholarly source, we mean from a peer-reviewed journal or university press book. A dissertation would also be acceptable, by the way, because that's essentially peer-reviewed. These are in addition to any sources taken from our textbook. So on the assumption that you will probably reference the article that you got your question from, this means you're likely to have at least 3 different sources, but you can always, of course, have more. MLA presentation and documentation, including correct works cited list. Okay. So let me just preview, and I'm hoping that you've looked at the Chapter 2 preview anyway, and I do probably a better and more thorough job. But Genoese is an article written shortly after the events of 9/11, and it basically talks about the dangers that we face in the world, but also the dangers that we face in how we respond to these dangers. Does that make sense? The danger of danger. Cohen takes us around the world looking at some unusual monsters, and some you've probably heard of and some that you probably haven't. Kind of a little bit, as I said, all around the world. Beowulf. If you're not familiar with the poem Beowulf, it is one of the oldest works conceived in the English language, although the original language of Beowulf is what we call Old English, which is not readable for people without a lot of education in Old English. I can't read it. I never studied Old English myself. But luckily we have a translation. Yep. And the story is a story, it's a hero story, right? It's a hero story of a hero named Beowulf who has to take on a monster called Grendel. Now, if you do know the Beowulf story, you know that the entire story, he actually takes on 3 different monsters. But this passage is probably the one that most people are familiar with in terms of the monster called Grendel. Visenor is also another hero story. This is taken from the Native American tradition. In fact, a tribe called the Anishinaabe. Sorry if I'm messing up the pronunciation. And this is a story of a young man who is trying to defeat a monster to save his people, which is, again, kind of classic hero. Kaplan is one of the more unusual pieces that we have in the entire textbook, because it takes a scientific look at monsters, and your first reaction might be, well, then the monsters disappear when you bring science in, right? Well, not exactly. What Kaplan is doing, though, is he's saying there are actually some legitimate reasons why people believed in monsters, based in some of the science. Poole, Monstrous Beginnings, takes us again to the Native Americans, but only this time as victims of European invasion. It examines the attitudes that many Europeans had toward the Native Americans and why, or at least partially at least, why they felt okay in persecuting and victimizing and just flat out massacring them. In addition, of course, sometimes Europeans turned on themselves, and the Poole article ends with some discussion of the Salem witch trials. Very famous event, of course. Bostrom introduces us to the problems of artificial intelligence, AI. AI, of course, has made its way into public consciousness mostly through science fiction, but this is not a science fiction work. Bostrom is talking about it in a pretty straightforward manner, but it's very, very scary. He posits basically that we very well may be planting the seeds of our own destruction. Asimov, Isaac Asimov, one of the great science fiction writers of the 20th century, has a work called I, Robby, from which this short story is taken, called Robby. It's called I, Robot. My bad. Robby is the name of the piece from I, Robot. And it involves a young girl and her friendship with a robot called Robby. It's a kind of a, shall we say, optimistic manifestation of what is possible with artificial intelligence. So these are the works for our chapter 2. Please read them all before deciding what to write on. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you can produce. Bye-bye.